Do you enjoy writing your own stories and designing your own campaigns? Maybe you just like exploring your character's background and world building. Do you want to develop your writing skills, but can't afford the time or money for a creative writing college program? Then the Adventure Writing Academy is just what you need. AWA is an online, Skype-based school co-developed by Fantasy Flight Games writer Keith Ryan Capel, a creative writing program that makes RPG writing a point of emphasis. In addition to a nerd-friendly curriculum, classes are joined by a rotating cast of guest students, each one a working professional in the field, there to help provide the guidance students receive. Last year, AWA featured familiar FFG names like Katrina Ostrander, Tim Cox, and Jason Marker, and RPG industry regulars like Ray Valise and Eric Cagle. And the final class session is a 4-hour lecture on the business of RPG writing, game theory, and design by the creator of the narrative dice system himself, industry superstar Jay Little. Improve your writing, collaborate, make connections, learn and grow in a friendly atmosphere of fellow nerds. Interested? Learn more and enroll today at www.adventurewritingacademy.com.
Correctly with the correct amount.
D20 Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.
Hello, Gamer Nation, and welcome to the Dice Ball Podcast, covering everything that you've ever wanted to know about how to run and play in the Genesis role-playing game by Fantasy Flight Games. I'm your host, GM Hooly, and this episode we have a very difficult topic to cover. But for the moment, let me introduce you to the people who will never give you up, never let you down, never run around and desert you. My hosts and friends, GM Huzz, GM Flano, and, returning again, GM Kaitlin. How are we all?
Hello.
Welcome back.
Thank you. Now that I have my technology all working, it's fantastic.
Yeah, it was a bit of a problem. But anyway.
Just a little bit when you're trying to do a podcast. Mine are particularly from another country. Technology is kind of imperative.
Yeah, we tried to use carrier pigeons, but we thought the delay for the listeners was a little bit too extreme. But
I thought so.
Somebody did give us some feedback to say that the impression at the end of the episode for last time was just absolutely uncanny.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Bizarre.
For a moment there, I thought we had you back.
Wow. That's just bizarre, people. So what's everybody been up to generally with gaming and whatever else? I know that we kind of skipped over it last time what we've been up to. So, Mike, what have you been up to?
Well, a lot, because it's been a long hiatus between our first Magic recording.
Yep.
In that time frame, I've done a lot of RPGs. No surprise there. Test plays. And L5R. Lots of L5R, which is good. There was a bit of a lull for a while, and because we had a lot of things going on. But we seem to be back on our feet. But basically, most of what I've been doing is that, just role-playing. I haven't done much in the way of miniature games lately. That's life.
There you go. Yeah. Martin, what have you been up to?
Hi, my name's Martin. I'm a relapsed WoW addict.
Oh, no. Wow.
Well, someone has to keep the player base up.
I even got my housemate addicted.
Wow. Yeah, Jay will be really happy about that. That's great.
So when Martin says he's been busy,
he hasn't been busy at
exactly
all.
what he's been doing. What's it called? What's the world called? I was going to say Terranor.
Azeroth. It's actually, it'd be a pretty cool setting for Genesis, to be honest.
I think that somebody actually has done a setting.
I think someone's done some work
They've
on
started it anyway, so yeah.
Yeah. But other than that, I've been playing the Spider-Man game.
Thanks for the PS4.
Yeah, we played...
Ethan's been sort of bugging me to get it. No doubt I'll cave.
Once I finish it, you could borrow mine.
Oh, look at that.
See, I would have bought it in a heartbeat if it was on PC. I don't want to play it on console. I'm a PC snob now. Mm-hmm. That's my life now.
But
And all these cool games are coming out on console. I'm like, what is this?
So yeah, the other stuff is, L5R, as we said. We have started a Dark Heresy.
Well, early stages of it.
Yeah.
We did our session 0 the other day with Kaitlin and her partner Chase, and myself and Martin. Ian, unfortunately, works that particular day,
Stupid work. Yep.
so he should quit his job so he can play Dark Heresy. But
Yep.
I support this.
Unfortunately, my bank balance doesn't.
Yeah, we'd have to support you.
Yes, exactly right.
Yes. Okay, maybe I retract that. I can't actually support that.
No, but
Financially, that is.
there is clearly a Patreon coming to you soon. No, sorry.
yeah, so we're using Tom Cruise's Dark Heresy Genesis
Yep.
setting.
Really well done.
Which is immaculate. So it's fantastic, and everything is that's been done in 2 books now, or three books if you include the Tower book.
Yeah.
Which is fantastic, and there's no work required from me as the GM to set up the world. It's all there in black and white.
Yeah.
So Kaitlin, Chase, and Martin, they made their characters the other night, and we've got. What are you playing, Martin?
I'm playing a Adeptus Arbite, an enforcer.
Who has been unfortunately.
A little bit disgraced.
Yeah. So that's why the Inquisition have him now, basically. It's like, well, you work for us, or your options are to...
Face the music and actually be prosecuted for my crimes.
Which isn't a good thing to face when you're an Adeptus Arbite. So...
It's usually death.
Yeah, so that's that. And,
Usually.
Or being turned into a servitor, which is worse than death.
And I think, Kaitlin, you can speak for your character and Chasers.
Oh, I'd like to be able to, but I'm so new when it comes to Dark Heresy. All I know is that we got my character, but then my main thing that I remember when we were doing it, because I haven't actually created it just yet, but it'll happen before our first game. Don't you worry.
Plenty of time.
But I remember that one of the cool things about my character is that he's got a demon trapped inside of his heart.
Yes.
And we've got a cage around his heart that he has to look after and make sure that the demon doesn't come out, which I think is one of the coolest character concepts that I've ever created.
It's not as romantic as it comes across, that's for sure.
You keep a demon in your heart.
Yeah.
And
It's more of like a parasitic type of one, which, let's be real, what relationships aren't like that, at least sometimes.
Yeah.
And
Anyway.
Chase's character is a priest with aspirations to become an Inquisitor. However, he's a
bit conflicted.
He's a bit conflicted because he's always had these inner powers, which he thought was a gift from the Emperor. However, it turns out, as the powers manifest, he's actually an unsanctioned psyker. So in the 40k setting, or Dark Heresy setting, that's not good, because that means you're a witch and you can be...
Which, yeah, he's a bit internally,
conflicted. So that could lead to some interesting role-play situations as they come up, especially when he tries to cast some sort of psychic power and accidentally opens a rift into the warp and spews forth denizens from there.
It's going to be so fun to roleplay.
Yeah.
An unsanctioned psycho working for the Inquisition under the pretense of being a priest.
Yeah.
It's an interesting concept.
But I think it's safe to say we have 3 pretty cool characters.
Yeah.
And I'm playing the GM, so the best of them all.
And so, Kaitlin, what have you been up to gaming-wise?
So it has been quite some time since we last spoke.
I know.
But in between then, I have joined a D&D campaign, which we play every fortnight now, which is fantastic to get back into playing some 5th edition D&D, which is really fun. I have got my tiefling, so my tiefling is finally there, but she's a bit more of a roguey kind of tiefling, which is a lot of fun because I just can be all sneak, which I love to play. I've also joined a Pathfinder campaign where I'm playing a witch, which is very different. So I get to hang around the back of the group and just do absolute mayhem on people while I cackle the whole time and extend all of my hexes on everyone, which is a lot of fun. I do enjoy doing some serious damage to people in terms of their decreasing. I can't remember the name of what debuffing. I do a lot of debuffings to the enemies, which is a lot of fun. And Star Wars campaigns, so doing a lot of Star Wars RPG. pretty much that has been my life. I've just recently started a new job as well. I'm not sure if we covered that the last one, but new job has unfortunately sucked a lot of the free time that I have because I'm working all the time. But that's pretty much most of the gaming that I've been able to get up to.
Cool.
And how about you, GM Hooly?
Well,
Yeah.
okay, where do I start? All right, so after dealing with our exploding mixer that I keep going on about, I've
It's an
done
explosive topic.
It is an explosive
It
topic.
is.
I mean, obviously, I game with you guys more than anything else. A lot of my time was spent for the 2 months while we were in hiatus writing for FFG as a freelancer on the L5R setting, which has been a lot of fun. Considering that I didn't have a lot of experience with regards to L5R beforehand, it's certainly opened my eyes, and I'm absolutely loving the setting and very much immersed myself.
So in that 2 months that you were working on that setting, how many years did you age?
Well, I'm probably around about 65 right now. it's just like...
That's not very clear.
Wow. Thanks very much. So
Got him.
So yeah, that's taken up a lot of the time. I've sort of gone and dabbled a little bit into something else,
Ooh.
which you guys aren't aware of. I've decided to start taking up Blood Bowl again, as in the old miniatures game. So the Connexio games.
So you're playing the new version?
I am playing the new version. I haven't got the new minis. I'm still using my old minis because stuff them. I'm not going to buy new ones.
I'm going to tell GW that, and you're going to get in lots of trouble.
They can sue me.
You know, once upon
please don't
as
do
of
that.
like maybe 2 months ago, I could have sold you all that stuff.
I know.
At wholesale.
I know. But that's okay. So, look, ultimately, everybody else has got boards because I'm playing at Connexio Games, which is a cafe in Brisbane, which we absolutely love.
Owned by one of the friends of the podcast.
Yes, who, after a little bit of a discussion, will probably be getting him onto the podcast at a later stage to discuss a very interesting topic as well.
Because he also recently worked on a Judge Dredd setting, Michael
Yes, he
Molyneux.
did. Yeah, absolutely. He's and we've started doing the playtest for that.
That was a lot of fun.
It's great. So we've only had one session, but it was a long one. So hopefully we can get into that again because had a lot of fun. It's interesting playing rather than GMing. It's great. I'm just not used to this whole playing thing. But anyway, it's good fun.
So now you've gone back into Blood Bowl.
Yes.
Do you enjoy like grinding your teeth in frustration every time you roll a dice? Is that?
Yes, I do because it's all about the fun at the table.
That you have with others. And,
Yeah, exactly. It's more the social aspect more than anything else so that I can get out of the house more, to be honest. But no, it's
That
a lot of
sounds
fun.
like someone who doesn't get a lot of good dice rolls says, because I say that. Oh, it's fine. I failed my 15th check in a row. I just come here to hang out with you guys.
I tend to play
That's
when
all.
I tend to play when I play Blood Bowl is because I can never pass the ball.
Right.
I just crush the opponent team.
I see. So you'd be an orc or a dwarf player, I would recommend.
Well, I
Would that
played
be right?
Vampire. The
There
Vampire
you go.
counts.
Right. Well, I'm just Dark Elves because that's the only team that I had because I sold all my other teams ages ago.
Yeah.
And I've gone, no, I'll just keep this.
What I should introduce you to is Corvus Belli's Aristea.
Right.
Yeah, I want to play this so bad.
What is it?
It's amazing. That's all you need to know.
Oh, okay.
It's a sports arena sort of game using
Right.
miniatures.
Yep.
You don't use a ball like you do in Blood Bowl. You instead try to get your team members to different quadrants on the board to try and score. Like the actual characters, the champions, are the ball. They need to move across the board table and get to here and there. So it's a very scrum-based game, but the mechanics, I adore it. Anyone who likes a combination synergy style game with champions, it's fantastic. It's one of the best games I've played.
Cool. The other thing that I've started looking at is doing Legacy of Fire, which is the old Pathfinder campaign, the adventure path, that I'm converting to Terranoth. So that'll be interesting to see how that goes.
Using Terranoth.
Yeah, using Terranoth.
Using the
so,
Genesis system and the Terranoth rules.
Just to see what it's like. Because a lot of people ask us, how do you convert that sort of thing? So I think it's important that we go and give that a go. And
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it'd be cool.
A look behind the curtains for everyone listening is, as much as we love Terranoth, we just haven't had a chance to play a whole lot of it.
No, that's right, because we've either been play testing or doing real life stuff. So yeah. But anyway, we'll do more. We'll talk more about that as we go. That may be even a show topic for a later stage.
Yeah.
But anyway, so should we get into our somewhat difficult topic?
Don't you mean Cora the show?
Yeah, that's a good name for a segment. Let's do that. Core of the show. And welcome to Core of the Show, the segment where we take a deep dive into a topic concerning the Genesis role-playing game and, of course, gaming in general. Now, tonight we're going to be taking a look at a topic we've received a lot of feedback on and the one that gets asked of us very often, namely, how to set a difficulty in a check in the Genesis role-playing game. Now, the rules offer some great suggestions for combat skill usages, magic skills, repairing and hacking, but what about everything else? How do you set the difficulty for lifting a bus out of a river to save the passages? How do you convince a room full of aliens that you're not about to take over their planet? Or how do you fix that broken communications array that will allow you to relay the plans of the latest superweapon to your companions who are lying in orbit? Tonight, we hope to answer these questions and many more as we talk difficulty levels in the Genesis role-playing game. So before we start, let's set the groundwork and discuss the basics. Sound good?
Yep.
Yeah, sounds good.
Sounds good.
All right, so the basics are that there are 3 difficulty dice, effectively, because you've got the positive dice and the negative dice. So tonight we're going to be talking the negative dice. So the negative dice are, of which there are 3. There is the normal difficulty dice, which is purple. We've got the black dice, which is the setback dice, which is the D6. And then we've got the challenge dice, which is the red D12. All right, now that we've covered the dice, so let's look at the difficulty levels, of which there are 7. So we have a simple check, which is no purple dice. We then have an easy check, which is 1 purple dice. An average check, which is 2. Hard, 3. 4 is daunting tasks. And then we have formidable, which is 5. Then we've also got the impossible task, which is exactly the same as formidable at 5 purple dice, but you do need to flip a destiny point to cover. Now, all of these difficulties are covered on page 16 and go for a little while into the book when looking at the different sorts of difficulties. And it even gives some examples on page 18. We're not going to go through each of those. We all know our listeners can read. They can just go in and take a look at that. And it gives some really good examples. But what the biggest question a lot of people ask is obviously, how do you do this on the fly? Because there's examples of social checks, there's examples of combat, obviously with ranges that are setting the difficulty. Magic has certain, like we talked about in the last 2 episodes, talks about what the difficulties are there, and even the hacking rules start going into that as well.
And these are all fixed.
Yeah, absolutely. But obviously, a lot of people are asking how we do that on the fly. How do we just make it up as we go? Because a lot of the time it's there. So let's sort of discuss what's the best way of doing that.
Because this is when we move into narrative play, which is the heart of this system.
Exactly.
Yeah, when the player asks that oddball, wants to do that oddball thing and you're not ready for it or you haven't prepared for it, because nor should you prepare for everything in the system. It's supposed to be pretty free-flowing, and that's what this is what the difficulty system is really good for in the system. You don't need to know the exact math crunch behind a number or value to set that difficulty, like you do in many other systems. Honestly, for me, my personal trick is when someone asks me for a task in a game, what they want their character to do, I use the handy thing of using the skill names. So if I think a task is hard, guess what? I use the hard difficulty. And that's the best way to approach it in that sense. Without having to look up the exact value of purple dice or whatever to the situation that's required. So instead of telling the player, instead of trying to think of it as a number of dice, think of it as what it's called. And that's a really good way to cheat the system. And after a while, after you've been doing that for a little bit, you'll start to get used to that. And as almost instinctually, you'll be able to throw out difficulty out there with no problems whatsoever. So, situation is a character wants to walk a tightrope. Now, that's a pretty hard thing to do. I wouldn't say it's a regular thing to do, standard, so it wouldn't be two purple dice. But at the same time, I wouldn't say it'd be daunting either. So it's pretty hard. You have to be pretty skilled to do that, but anyone could do it with a little bit of training. So hard check. So what's that? 3 purple dice. And in 2 seconds, I've established the difficulty of the dice, the difficulty of the roll, and there's no delay. They can dive straight in. Personally, for me, most checks, if the check's required, set it at standard. Just 2 purple dice.
Yeah, just 2 purple dice for an average check. Yeah.
And even a really highly skilled character can fail with 2 purple dice. We've seen it time and time again.
Yes.
We've seen
Yes,
people
they can.
We've seen people fail on simple checks.
Exactly.
So,
but yeah, that's my tip anyway, is to just use the names of the difficulties. And this sounds like basic information, but challenge yourself as a GM next time you're playing. Don't look at the book.
Don't look at the chart.
Don't look at the chart.
Sorry, did you have something, Kaitlin?
Oh, I was just going to say as well is that you can consider about what the difficulty of the check is, but what is really great about the Genesis system and the narrative dice is that you can still add narrative elements to it and increase the difficulty even further than that. I think we're going to talk a little bit about boost and setback dice, but don't always get so worried, oh, this is going to be a hard check, but 3 purple dice, that looks like that's going to be a little bit easy. You can still, and particularly when you're dealing with those higher level characters that are still going to be rolling, 3 or 4 yellow dies with that, you can still make it even that little bit extra challenging by adding those boosts, by adding those challenging by adding setbacks, but to considering what is happening around there. So whilst it might be a hard check, and even the most skilled player can still fail on a hard, simple check, considering I have done that previously.
We've all been there.
Many times. Those setbacks can really be something that adds that little bit of extra flavor to setting a difficulty.
Yeah, and the setbacks and boost dice is a whole another thing we're going to talk about very soon. Like it's a whole another field in this whole different discussion.
But that does lead into what I was going to say, which is just a bit of advice is be consistent when setting the difficulty, because if someone's walking a tightrope and you think it's a hard check, and then 6 months down the track they're walking a tightrope, it doesn't matter what other prevailing factors, such as wind and things like that, because that's the province of setback and things. You need to make sure that you're setting the same difficulty for the same task.
And obviously the GM police aren't going to come knock on your door if you forget that you set that tightrope.
Exactly. No, that is true, but I'll tell you right now, the players may.
Exactly, the players may.
They are the GM police.
The players remember things like that.
I guess to add to what Kaitlin and GM Flano just said, always treat your difficulty as a baseline. Consider other factors, environment, whatever might be else be going on in the scene as additional things. So your baseline difficulty more or less should never change. So that tightrope, no matter what that tightrope's expanding across, be it lava, water, or a truck filled with feather cushions, it should always be 3 purple dice. Other factors is how you modify it, and that's what we're going to get into very soon.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's also something like, if to make it a little bit easier as well, is that you're not necessarily thinking about how difficult the task is for the character that is wanting to do the check, because that's what the skill dice is for the character rolling it. So it's always to consider how difficult is this for the actual task for anyone, not necessarily, but that I know that person is a sneaky character, so doing a sneak is actually going to be relatively easy for them. It is about the task at hand, not the character undertaking it.
And don't try to avoid factoring in player XP as well.
Yeah.
Or even their ability to remove setback and things like that.
Too.
Or lower the dice, because that's the character being skillful, not the difficulty of the task.
Right. So if the PC that is attempting whatever task it is, remove them from the equation, what would the average Joe, thanks to Average Joe for making all those skill checks for us.
Thanks, Joe.
But for the average Joe, what sort of difficulty would that be? And then pull away and go, right, well, now we're adding the skill dice to see how well our character is going to go.
And honestly, factoring in those other elements of a check is the funnest part of making a check.
I would agree.
If you factor in all the other factors that go into that single check into just your overall difficulty, it's boring.
Yeah.
And
well, it's windy. There's lava below, etc., etc., etc. Oh, and you're also over encumbered. Well, that check's going to be daunting. No, that check shouldn't be daunting. It still should be. In this case, hard.
Yeah.
Then you factor in everything else.
And it robs the player because they've spent XP in the ability to, remove ignore prevailing factor, ignore the weather, ignore the wind. They're not afraid of things. They've got abilities to, do all of these things to lower that check. If you're factoring in those things already into your difficulty, the player can't use what they've built their character to do.
Because if you use that as an example, so if we say that whatever it is, that sets your difficulty based on what you perceive. If there are any additional external factors, such as wind, such as the tightrope sort of fraying at the other end, that's the realm of setback. But if you feel that this particular scenario is really, really dangerous, that's the realm of upgrades. So you're still keeping the same difficulty base, but you're just changing those purples over to reds.
Yep. Which is,
Yeah. And I think that's a really important distinction between when we talk about setting a difficulty versus adding boost and setback and also upping. That is a really good explanation about when we're talking about all the different stages of how to build that dice pool.
Just saying though, this tightrope, it's very popular. Everyone's just running across it.
But I think that's a good point for us to now move to the next
Absolutely, yeah. So, look, let's talk about boost and setback because, not so much necessarily boost, but certainly the realm of setback.
I think both are still very prominent.
Sure. So let's look at setback first up because that's kind of the things that are as we've already spoken about, the theme. So it's talking about what's external to the scenario that is going to impact it.
For those out there who have played a lot of D&D and other similar games that have modifiers, setback dice and boost dice are your modifiers.
Yep.
That's how you calculate the math, if you will, into checks and Genesis.
They're your plus twos, minus twos. Yep.
So that's why I know I'm guilty of it. When I very first started playing the narrative dice in Star Wars, I was encompassing all those factors mostly into the difficulty dice.
Yep.
But when you look at individual factors that go on with the check, like as we were saying before, the over-encumbered backpack, the wind, rain, etc., you look at each of those conditions and apply a setback. So that can lead to, as a GM, you shouldn't feel like there's a hard limit to the number of setback you can set, but you have to be realistic about it as well, I feel. So what's some examples of this tightrope again, when you would issue setbacks?
Phobias.
There's lava,
yes.
There's flying birds, there's wind, there's 5 setback already.
One of GM Hooly did just say phobias. Now, this is something that I was going to bring up is the fear mechanic. If there is a reason for the player to be afraid, that can generate setback all on its own.
Absolutely. So if they make a fear check, one of the results of failing a fear check is you get a setback die for any action that you're doing in that next encounter.
Yep.
So that would certainly apply, that you get a setback. But the other thing that I feel is important with setback is to provide a lot of them. And the reason is because you have talents that can remove them. And there is nothing better to a player, correct me if I'm wrong, guys.
It's good.
But there is nothing better to a player to go, well, I know you've just given me 5 setback die, but I've got -2 because of knack for it. And so you take away that. And so it means that, yes, sure, it may only be a 5, because it's a ranked talent, I guess it could be anything. But as the base, it's a 5 point, and it's only 5 XP. But I tell you what, the joy, the satisfaction that comes from a player that can go, I don't think so, Mr. GM.
Well, I know the number of times that I've been at the table and I've gone to you, well, maybe I get a setback because of this. You go, yeah, sure, no, excellent. I remove it. And it's a little bit of ammunition the player has to defy the odds.
Yeah,
it makes them feel special,
Yeah.
like they're using that ability on their character.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to add setback or be free with that.
Yeah.
But only when it's appropriate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Don't. It's a bit of a tough. I feel you can go too far with it, but at the same time you can go not far enough.
Yeah.
So I've seen in previous games I've been involved with where a GM will throw in all these conditions like wind, rain, over-encumbered backpack
Lava.
and lava, all these different things, and they'll go, okay, take one setback for it.
Yeah.
Okay. I have to object or sidetrack for a moment. There's the two things that have come up that I think don't belong under setbacks.
Right.
The fraying rope and the lava.
Okay.
Right.
I think that they're upgrades to
Lava?
I think that they're upgrades to challenge dice
Okay.
in this case, because if you're walking a tightrope
Yep.
across a pit of lava,
Yep.
that doesn't make it more difficult to do unless, you've failed a fear check.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it does upgrade it to a challenge dice because there's an element of danger here
Yeah, sure.
that if a
That's a
despair
good point.
comes up,
Yep.
you could fall.
Yep.
And
That is a really good distinction.
It is. And that's definitely something we want to cover in even more detail
We
very
will get to
soon.
it.
Yeah,
and that's a
absolutely.
perfect example. A lot of GMs will see those other elements like lava and whatnot, and the fraying rope, and go, well, that's setback or difficulty increases.
Yeah, it's not.
Which is not.
No. So yeah, just set that difficulty right from the get go, and then build on that from there. The other thing which I think is an important note is that if you feel that the PCs are just going to be able to get through this more easily, and you've got that sort of right. Well, I'm gonna upgrade that difficulty. Don't. Sort of go against that instinct.
Unless you're introducing a story element, then flip a story point, and
That's right.
if it's going to promote the story, not detract from it.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
True.
But
I think as well what you can do, particularly if it's like, oh, they're going to easily like go through this, like they're going to succeed in these checks. Not always, but even if you add a setback and they get a disadvantage or they get a threat, they get a threat or anything like that, you can still use those as in when you're interpreting the dice.
Yeah.
So that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to get cancelled out. But if you say, I'm going to add a setback because it's incredibly windy as you're going across this tightrope, and they do happen to get a threat as a result of that, you can use the setback that you added to actually interpret what happens as a result of that of that roll. So they might make it and they might do really, really well. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be smooth sailing because of that setback die you've just added.
Well,
and it can add that little bit of a difference when you're interpreting the roll.
Well, that's when you can use that's when you can use, like, even though this is a good example, people sometimes, like in this situation, they'll make that check and they will get across the tightrope and roll some threat.
Right.
Depending on how many threat they roll, because as GM Kaitlin just said, the wind, etc., that's generated from the setback dice. As boring as it sounds, sometimes just dishing out one or two strain can be as a neat and simple system. You don't have to overthink that every single roll, because that strain in this case, even though it's the wind buffeting the players or the character, I should say, they're being buffeted by the wind. It hasn't pushed them off the cliff, off the tightrope. However, it's caused them to stress out a little tiny bit, and they've gained strain.
Yeah.
And that will add up. If you're doing that, from time to time in these checks, by the time they get to combat, they're going to have half their strain threshold.
Yeah.
That matters.
Absolutely. And you can go
And even then, how much cooler is that as a story in going, I'm walking across, and then something like it happens in every narrative when you see someone trying to cross a tightrope or cross a rickety bridge, something happens that makes it a little bit not so easy and makes the characters think. So even narratively, it can really change that moment from something, I crossed the bridge, to, ooh, maybe I do it, but it's a little bit shaky.
Yeah.
It makes it cooler than just I walk.
Absolutely. Look, the other thing to take into consideration as well is that two setback die, two threat equates to a setback die. So you can mix and match with that, as like if they're rolling 4 threat, you may want to not go, lose 4 threat. It might be a case of lose 2 strain and then have a setback die because you're somewhat flustered as you're sort of catching your breath on the other side.
Another suggestion for where to spend that threat. Now, I don't recommend this for every game because it could be a bit mean, but if there's something important they're carrying across that bridge and they roll 3 threat, have them drop it. And then they've got to go and recover it. Or...
Yeah. It's very difficult.
Not if there's lava.
Hence why there's a caveat.
Yes.
So at the moment, we're using the tightrope as an example, and because it's the most obvious sort of one that people can picture in their head.
Sure.
But I think it might be useful for us to sort of go around the table and put the setting of difficulty and implementing setback in other circumstances.
Sure.
So I might throw one to you, GM Hooly.
Sure.
I'm infiltrating my character's infiltrating a ballroom, and she has to try and track down the head of some villainous crime organization without giving up the fact that she's a spy. So she has to go around this ballroom talking to people, making small talk, blending in. So my goal here is to find a way to get in touch with this crime lord via talking to people in the room.
Sure.
So what sort of difficulty are we looking at here?
Okay, so in this sort of scenario, I would be looking at probably just an average check.
Average check, okay.
To be talking to different people. However, you're asking sort of pertinent information of a ballroom that may be filled with criminals, that sort of thing. So, maybe it might be one or two setback, depending on how well known you are. Like if you're a known spy or they know that something's going on, you might get a setback die for that, given the fact that the information that you're after is another setback die.
Well, you could almost do it. Fact one, you're a stranger, no one knows you. That's one setback.
Yeah. Yep.
Another setback is you're asking these somewhat poignant questions.
Yes.
Another setback.
Yep.
And maybe a third setback because everyone knows that the crime lord is under investigation.
Now, if you had the scenario, though, where they knew that somebody, like that information is passed around the room, and there is a chance that, there may be a spy among them, what you might do is you might upgrade the check instead. So you would have one purple and one red.
Exactly.
Just in case that despair comes up, that person has recognised, I know what this person is, and they will go and speak to the authorities to say, look, this person's doing this.
So there's one example where the difficulty has not changed. It's still staying at 2.
2 purple dice.
It's now upgraded 1, so now it's 1 purple, 1 red, with 3 setback.
Yep.
Now, that's a pretty hard check, even if you are a skilled charmer type who can infiltrate these scenarios.
Yep.
However, if my character is used to this, because they are a trained spy, I've taken a knack for it. So I'm taking away 2 of those setback dice.
Yep.
Now I'm rolling 1 red, 1 purple, and 1 black. And that
Correct.
immediately makes my character feel useful. It's given that character a spotlight moment because, well, I'm here in my element, so I'm going to take away these 2 setback dice.
Yep.
You as a GM have empowered your player, invested them in the story,
Yep.
and overall have boosted their chances of passing that check greatly, which is great.
And the other thing as well is that, as Kaitlin mentioned before, those 3 setback die have a reason why they exist. So as you using your knack for it, you can say, well, I'm removing this setback die because of this reason. I'm removing that one for this reason. And all that's left is this other reason. So if that comes up as a threat and you end up with only having a threat, well, you know exactly where that's come from.
That's right. And it's fantastic.
Yeah, particularly as well when you get feedback going, oh, I'm not quite sure how I should interpret it, or this has come out of the dice roll. Like, what am I supposed to do with all this threat or all this setback, or how am I going to interpret this in this situation? Looking at what the dice is there for and the reason why that dice pool has been created in the way it has is a really good lead into how you can interpret that.
It's a good aid. You definitely follow. I feel like in some cases you might not need it. Sometimes
particularly if you roll a despair.
Yeah, that's right. Despair. And despair in this sort of situation is very obvious what a despair is.
Yeah.
But what happens if I succeeded with a despair in the situation?
That is a really good question. Perhaps that you get the information that you're after, but you've been discovered, and so they've raced off. They know you've got it, and they've raced off to go and speak to the security. So that creates a scenario that you've got to get out with the information that you've had.
It makes your next challenge more difficult.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or you actually managed to arrange a meeting with this crime lord. However, with that despair, he knows you.
Yes.
The second you walk into his little private bar or wherever he may be, he's like, oh, I know you. And then
I've been expecting you.
Exactly. It's that sort of that very cinematic Hollywood moment.
Yeah.
It's how Thanos knew Captain America, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So for another example, I was thinking of perhaps that you actually leading on, say you did get a despair in the last check, and I'm going to just continue it on with the same theme.
Ooh.
And you have to get away quickly.
Cool.
So you are now in a car. However, and imagine whatever car and whatever setting you want, but you're in a car and you have to try and get away quickly. You have people following you and you have to get through the city streets to try and get away safely from whoever is chasing you. What kind of difficulty would that be?
Probably more information, please. So how heavy is the traffic?
I don't know. How heavy is the traffic? Is there heavy traffic that requires a setback?
I think that's going to be the GM will be implementing those with setback, and will be telling the player those narrative moments as the check unfolds, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the way I see this, there's multiple checks that are going to be required because we're entering into the territory of a chase.
Sure.
Well,
But
what happens if we were to boil this down to one check, which you can do if
we
the
can
system.
do, yes.
Yeah.
So what are the important narrative elements here? We've got to get away.
Mm-hmm.
We've also had a despair, which is the reason why we have to get away. So that's very it's not just, I have to try and be discreet. You have to get out of there in a hurry.
Yeah, so at the moment, we're not being chased. We've got to get away fast enough that we don't pick up a tail or something like that. Is that sort of what we're getting at?
Sure, why not?
Yep.
Let's do it.
So that sounds to me...
We're creating this as we go.
Exactly. So we've got to go from point A to point B quietly and fast enough that there's not any sort of issues that arise.
Yep.
That sounds at least hard to me because it's been the result of a despair.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
Possibly because it is a result of despair, we might want to upgrade that once because there's scrutiny on us. So that there's a red challenge dice automatically. Now there is a lot of we're getting away from a place that possibly has a lot of people, a lot of traffic going on. So yeah, there might be a few cars and people around that we've got to deal with.
Well, you're going for a city, so let's say
Absolutely.
that immediately that's anyone who knows driving out of a city quickly is it's near impossible. So you're going to need to know shortcuts and stuff like that. So
yeah.
Can I throw
and as you know, which they're not familiar with this area because they're not known, so you don't know the city streets as well. So not only do you have to drive in the city streets, you don't know those city streets very well.
And the city just happens to be New Orleans at the time of festival. As I flip another destiny point, that's suddenly one of those
Story
purples.
point.
Sorry, story point. I do that all the time. You flip a story point, and there's a
two
festival.
Potential,
Yeah.
So currently we're looking
dice.
at everyone,
There's so many distractions if you're going to be in New Orleans at the time of a festival.
Yeah.
well that's
Keep your eyes on the road.
well that's the only reason why the crime lord was in town. He came for the festival. Well, you see how the story tells us.
I know.
So far we've got 2 red dice.
Yep.
1 purple. Mm-hmm. And we've got...
Give me some setbacks, Martin.
We've got some setbacks.
Yeah,
so
I'd say
there's
we got at least 2.
At least 2 for
Two
traffic.
setbacks.
For the traffic, yeah.
Traffic and also not being familiar with the area.
Yep.
I'd possibly take that up to 3 because it's heavy traffic because it is festival.
Heavy traffic is 2 setback.
So 2 setback, and then not being familiar is at least 1, as Kaitlin has said.
Well, that's
What else?
just interject real quickly. That's a good point. You can put multiple setback in for the one condition. So if that traffic is bumper in the middle of a festival, that could very well be 2 setback. In this case, it is.
I'd also like to say that it's getting on dark. Your vision, your sight is not very good at this time of day. So maybe lower that, add another setback for that.
So it's a 4 setback now?
That's 4 setback total.
Wow.
Okay.
This is an incredibly hard check.
But your
there's a lot
player
of line.
has
It is a lot of
player has the
have
shortcut
knack for
talent. So knack for it, yes.
I'm always going to have knack for everything in any character I do. It's always going to have knack for it because it's such an amazing talent for this exact reason. It allows you to be awesomely epic when you're doing some of your checks.
All right, just real quick. This car you've jumped into,
no.
it happens
Equipment.
to be... No equipment. It happens to be a Lamborghini.
Oh.
Because the character just flipped a story point.
boost.
And
He did flip a story point, didn't
this
he?
car is boosted as a Lamborghini. And it has a handling of at least +2.
Yeah.
So immediately this check, surely the car's handling can help in the situation. Getting away quickly, moving in and out of traffic. So the GM, the player could encourage the GM to allow to use the car's handling for this check.
Yep.
And you can
that's
add
+2.
2 boost dice.
We commonly call that, I commonly call it, everybody does, fishing for boosts.
It's my favorite hobby.
That's a solid you're using the car, it's in
But
there.
But let's go to another sort of extent as well, is that this player's not doing it alone. So maybe the person who has computers back at base says,
mapping a route
look,
for him.
I'm going to work around. We've seen it in Mission Impossible. You know, with Simon Pegg, he's basically going right, left, right, no, you know, and I've got it upside down.
That sounds like Setback to me.
But yeah, you could do a combined check. Using your driving skill versus
this could be a reason
computers.
to use different stats.
Yeah,
the person's using
absolutely.
their intellect to guide you, and
That's right.
However, for the sake of simplicity for the listeners,
Yes.
let's not do a completely combined check. Let's just say the assistance is getting from the operator over the phone gives him another boost dice.
He's asked Siri.
Yeah. So what are we looking at now? 3 boost dice? No.
3 boost
Three
dice,
dice, 3 setback dice.
4 setback
Four
dice.
setback dice.
Unless he's got knack for it, in which case it's only 2.
Yep. Knack for driving.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
So what's the end result there, man? What are we looking at?
2 red, 1 purple, 2 setback dice, and what do we say? 3 boost.
3 boost for that check.
There you go.
I think he's got a good chance.
He's got a great chance.
Got a good chance of crashing and burning.
That dice, even though that's encompassing, even though the dice roll is just 1 check, that's encompassing an entire scene of the car getting away.
Yep.
Which is another example of you don't need to make every single scene in Genesis a multi-initiative roll, dice check scenario.
But the best thing about this is that we added boost and setback.
Correct.
Which means that when we're interpreting the dice pool, we know where that's
these
come
things
from.
come from. Yeah.
And that adds to the narrative of telling the story of how this guy got away. And it takes next to no time because it's a single check.
All right. So I get away. Well, I make the check, and I fail
With despair?
with 2 despairs.
Please be the
Okay.
despair.
He
There's
has
lava.
crashed.
Into the lava factory.
Into the lava pit that was hidden underneath the car park all along. Who does that? An evil crime lord has a lava pit under a car park.
It makes sense.
I would say
It does. It's legit. It checks out.
I would say what's happened here is that the guy guiding him, depending on where these setback and boosts have come from, the guy guiding him has told him to take a turn using his Google Maps where it hasn't been updated yet.
Yep.
And because he's going at fast speeds, he's turned down a road that's actually been cordoned off for the festival that's going on.
Oh, he plows through the festival?
He either plows through the festival if you want to be dark,
Seeds everywhere.
His car was an unscheduled float.
Wow.
or he crashes into a float or hits a barricade and the car is wrecked.
Right.
He doesn't die. He might take a crit or something because he's been in the vehicle when this has happened.
This is 2 despairs, though. Perhaps not only has it happened, he's crashed the car. Immediately, there's police everywhere because it is a festival.
Well, yes, but I didn't want to make it too bad. That's why I'm saying there's a crit to the player, and we just resolve it that way.
Yep.
And then we move to the next thing is making sure the police don't see you.
See, for me,
Subtle.
for me, 2 despairs just says the Winter Soldier shows up.
That's where I think it's another discussion point later on.
Yeah.
2 despairs, even though it sounds terrible, may not necessarily be the world-ending event that we think it might be.
No, that's right.
He's definitely crashed because he's gotten at least 1 despair, and that's sort of what it's representing. And that's where it came from. We added the festival. But it doesn't need to be the end of the show because he's rolled 2 despairs.
That is true. Very good. So that's talking about boosts and setback die and how we can sort of add those to the scene to really, really set the scene for the scenario and using those dice to tell the story.
Just real quick before we move on to the next conversation point, we sort of glossed over boost dice because boost dice, about 50% of the time, come from talents, abilities, weapons, etc.
Yep.
However, it's nothing wrong with the player asking the GM for boost dice.
Yeah.
Because often fishing, as we call it, fishing for boost dice, which makes it sound worse than it actually is when it really isn't. It's just it's just the terminology we use. But
It is really fun though, particularly when you're thinking about everything. If you're thinking about difficulty, but
absolutely,
as a player, I would highly recommend that you do it and support your players in doing this.
Well, because it also adds narrative to the story.
It adds narrative, and it means then that the PCs are becoming invested in the story, and that's what you're wanting.
And another reason why fishing can be so important is the GM, again, is thinking of a million different things.
Yep.
So he doesn't know what your character might be good at, what your character might have up their sleeve, etc. So it might be worthwhile pointing out boost dice situations or conditions or events or whatever you want to call it to the GM. Most of the time, the GM will be like, "Oh yeah, well that makes sense." Like the handling on the car, for example.
Yep.
Or
It's probably not something you would factor in straight away until the player suggests it.
I've got a great example.
Sure.
So you may have a guy, an eye in the sky that's guiding you down the road, making sure that everything's clear, but you did spend time before this event planning an escape route. Your GM may not necessarily think about that at the time, so you go, well, we spent a lot of time, examining the roads and planning this before it happened. I now need to get away. Does that give me a boost die?
A perfect example of it.
Yep.
And there's a lot of factors which the players can interject, which can add a boost dice. And the GM shouldn't be... It's an adversarial mindset. The GM shouldn't be like, well, you've got 2 setbacks. I'm not going to give you any more boost dice than that. If it makes sense, put it in.
Yep.
If it feels far-fetched, maybe put it in. But then think of a way to give them another setback.
Yeah.
Which is something we commonly do when we're playing. It's that moment. It's nothing better than seeing the glee in the player's eye.
Well,
As they've like really stretched for that boost dice, but then you've really stretched for a setback dice as well.
sometimes they hand you perfect examples of how to add
Exactly.
setback.
Exactly.
Perhaps I can have it for this. And it's like, no, I don't think so. But that's a really good idea for a setback die. Have an extra setback die.
And just because you add a boost die doesn't necessarily mean that boost doesn't also come with the setback as well. Like, say, for example, the Lamborghini, right? Well, the boost was, we found a Lamborghini. It's got great handling, and, it's super fast. So that's a boost. Could also be a setback because you're wanting to not cause attention to yourself. And Lamborghinis tend to cause a lot of attention everywhere they go.
That is
so you get a
perfect.
boost because you have a Lamborghini, but a setback because it's a Lamborghini.
Well, that the crime lord's gold-plated Lamborghini does draw some attention. Doesn't it?
It does. But the other thing as well is that when you are GMing, you tend, and if the longer you're playing, you tend to you can sometimes remember what your characters do remove setback for. That doesn't necessarily mean that you should stop putting setback in because they're just going to remove it.
Right.
Like I know in one of the games with GM Hooly, I had a character that in any social situation just constantly removed setback, but Hooly kept on adding setback every single time so I could continue using those talents. Because otherwise, you're right. Why'd you bother spending XP if it's not going to come in handy?
Exactly right.
So even as a GM, if they're going to remove it, still add it and have that cool narrative moment that allows that character to do that.
It may seem like, hey, if I just don't worry about adding it, it's streamlining the game and quickening the pace. But all it really does achieve is make the player feel, I wouldn't say neglected because that's the wrong word, but it takes away their achievement, their investment in their character because, why don't bother spending
cheapens
XP?
it.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and if you start doing that, the players are just going to never buy those talents.
I mean, that's one thing, but I mean, it's having 2 negative effects. One thing is we've already mentioned, with that it's cheapening the experience of spending that XP, but it's also you're taking away from the scene because 2 of those elements
it's a chance
for those
for story.
2 setback that you've just inserted into the scene may add so much more flavour. To the scenario.
Well, it adds flavour when you add. There's prevailing winds here at the tightrope walking contest.
Yep.
The player says, "Well, I'm special at tightrope walking."
Yep.
It's already added story because they've just removed that due to their skill.
Yep.
And additionally as well, it's sort of similar to what GM Hooly just said, adding those setback and boost dice adds flavour to the scene. Let's not forget we're sitting around a table doing a shared imagination game. So just saying it's windy and adding a setback immediately paints the picture of the scene
Exactly.
for everyone around the table. And that's very important. And I feel sometimes that can be glossed over, especially when doing lots of checks in one night. But just the mentioning of that one element can just change so much in the players' minds and help their investment.
Well, for example, one of the things that this is going to be a little bit of a distraction for a moment, but because I've been running a little bit of L5R recently, one of the things that was a bit of feedback that came back from one of the players was that I wasn't necessarily showing as much description. And then I started thinking about that a little bit more. And because I've been used to Genesis all the time, adding setback die, adding boost die is actually doing that.
They're your paintbrushes.
They're your paintbrushes. And because I'm doing L5R where that's not necessarily a big thing, that you suddenly go, oh, I've been using that. It's become so ingrained into me that adding those boosts and adding those setback die are setting the scene.
Yeah.
So, that's sort of I don't know, to me, it's highlighted the importance of doing that.
Yeah.
In this game.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about, obviously, the dice. We've talked about the difficulty levels. We've spoken about the rule of thumb, I guess, is use the language for setting your difficulties.
Yep.
So if something's average or something's hard, but
It's average and hard.
it's average and hard, or if something's, somebody was on average would be doing this, would be completely daunted by what they're experiencing. Well, that would be a daunting check. So just using the language that you are using to describe a scene is what you should use as the basis for setting that difficulty in the first place. We've talked about boosts and setback dice to make sure that you're always adding those. But, Martin, we haven't really talked about upgrading, increasing difficulty. So there's a little bit of something that's in the rulebook pertaining to upgrades, isn't there?
Yeah, it's something that gets glossed over a little bit. I mean, we've been doing it in our little examples here, but I'm not sure if we've made it really clear. And so on page 20 of the core rulebook, it discusses the possibility of increasing or adding challenge dice to a check without necessarily having flipped a story point. Now, I'll read out the little paragraph because it's only short from the book regarding this. It says, in some cases, your GM may upgrade one or more of these difficulty dice by removing them from the dice pool and replacing them with an equal number of challenge dice. Difficulty dice are usually upgraded into challenge dice when your character faces skilled opposition or particularly challenging circumstances, or when your GM invests a story point to make a check more challenging. So you don't necessarily have to flip a story point because that gets you into an adversarial mindset as well. I mean, flip it where it's appropriate if you're introducing a story element that's not already been in the scene.
Yeah.
But if it's if you're doing the tightrope walk over the lava, that is inherent to the check. That's already existing in this scenario. It's more challenging. Add it.
Me and GM Hooly were on a car trip to your place, Martin, and we'd had a big discussion about this. And the mindset for a lot of players about challenge dice is that they can only really come into a check when the rules tell them to come into a check, which isn't the case at all.
No.
The two most common times that players will put challenge dice into a check is when A, they're fighting someone of adversary, or 2, their story point is flipped. And because the most common thing is flipping a story point, the GM flips a story point against the players, and all of a sudden there's a challenge dice in the pool. And the reason why challenge dice seem like they have a cost to them is because one of the most common ways of putting them into the game is with a cost. Whilst it shouldn't be the case, it should be the flipping a story point to add a challenge dice should be more infrequent in a way.
Yeah.
In very special circumstances where you wouldn't normally do it.
This is my example. So you're walking across the tightrope. There's lava. So you've got one challenge dice there already.
Yep.
Because that's the scene that's been described. But then,
Lava.
then your storyteller goes, well, you might not have seen it, but the rope started to fray at the other end, and he flips a story point.
Yep.
That he's introducing a story element that's not already been described in the scene in order to upgrade the difficulty. That I see is the purpose of story points regarding difficulty.
Yep. However, because that lava is there, that's your inherent danger.
That's inherent danger.
Instead of increasing the difficulty dice of that check,
Because walking the tightrope isn't any more difficult.
correct. But chuck in a upgrade, a challenge dice, because it's naturally dangerous. If you fall from that tightrope,
Something bad's
something
gonna
bad's going to happen. And that's when challenge dice should be chucked into more checks more often. And I know we're fairly guilty of it. It's something we're trying to break the habit of. Because it's one of those mindsets. You play for a certain way for so long, you get into that sort of rhythm.
And by not doing it, it makes despair this terrifying thing. Whereas sometimes it should be as simple as, you run out of ammo.
Exactly. And if you flip through the Star Wars books especially, there's loads and loads of pieces of equipment which have a despair result condition. And there's nothing like your weapon explodes or, Darth Vader teleports in front of you or anything like that. It's just you run out of ammo or the weapon jams or takes one level of damage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know it's easy to see that despair and everyone at the table gasp in horror. Oh no, my weapon's going to explode and all this nasty stuff is going to happen. Not necessarily the case. Just having a player run out of ammo, although seems minor, can be really detrimental if they haven't got a reload pack.
Or they trip and fall.
Yeah, there's exactly. There's so much you can do with a despair that isn't necessarily this big, grand, overarching element to the story.
And it can even... this is the thing as well. Despair and threat can drive the narrative forward. Ideally, that's what you want them to do. You don't want them to stop the game dead because you can't think of something.
Yep.
They should help describe the scene and push the party towards the objective.
And the other thing as well is don't be afraid when a despair comes up is to allow the players to work out what they think would be appropriate.
Sometimes they'll give you the best
Oh, I
ideas.
know.
Right?
Most of the time the players will know what despair is in that situation before they even roll it. And so when that despair does come up, they just go, well, my fears just came to fruition.
Because I think that it really is a case that as you have said a number of times throughout the episode, Huzz, is that the GM is doing 50 million things at once. And so, especially towards the end of a session when, it may have been a long 6-hour session that you've been gaming for, that
Those are rookie numbers. You've got to pump them up.
that you are seriously just going, oh, my brain is just hurt from trying to calculate this. And to have the players then go, well, maybe a despair would be this. And I tell you what is not a bad thing either, is to go, okay, so what does everybody think? And you might get 2 or 3 suggestions for a despair, and then everybody go, oh, that's a really good one. Yeah, let's do that.
Yep.
And so that, because it's this collaborative effort of telling the story.
Which is one of the key elements of this
Wow,
game system.
Love it so
Absolutely,
much.
Yeah. The other thing to take into consideration as well, as far as the times that things get upgraded, another example of that does get used quite often is when you have an opposed check as well.
That's another thing.
So, if you're making a negotiation, for example, between, you and a merchant, you might end up coming across a merchant that has 2 skill ranks. So therefore, it's going to be upgraded twice.
And that's
things
exactly
like
what it mentions. Skilled opposition.
Yeah. I guess, it's a matter of training your brain to look at despairs appropriately to the scene without overthinking them.
Yeah, well, one of the things that this does as well is sometimes you're trying to hide and you don't want to be seen, right? If you're frequently adding challenge dice for narrative reasons in the story, the player's not going to necessarily know they're facing skilled opposition.
Yeah,
because you've just added red dice.
That's true.
This helps to disguise that fact because it's a natural part of the game.
Yeah, it's funny. Despair, as soon as you defang a despair a little bit, the concept of adding challenge dice to rolls more often isn't as horrifying as it sort of appears.
Statistically, it really doesn't do much other than add the option to have a despair.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. The difference between the two, a red dice and a purple dice, is marginal. It really is, except the red has the despair result.
Yeah.
To put the brakes on that a little bit, though, one thing that you do need to take into consideration, because there are people that are coming from fairly adversarial systems, is don't throw a challenge die in just because you feel you want to be difficult.
Yeah.
Make sure that there is a reason you have in your head of, even if it's just a fleeting thought, to go, wouldn't this be cool if this happened?
Yeah.
Or does the scenario allow for that to happen?
Because
and then
otherwise you end up with the brakes being put on the game.
Yeah, that's right. And the same thing also applies to spending story points as well. Get out of the habit of just because the PCs, upgrade, that means that you have to as well. If they let them have their moment in the spotlight where they've flipped a destiny point, it'll come back round.
Yep.
Don't just always do that automatic. Give them a round or two with no access to story points and watch them sweat. And then all of a sudden you flip up because the story has demanded it. And, as you're working through the story, allow that sort of to build till you get to that point where this is the appropriate moment to flip that story point.
If you're upgrading a check with the challenge dice, generally speaking, ask yourself as a GM, try not to speak to yourself out loud because then the players might think you're crazy, or do it, whatever. Keep them on the edge of the seat.
Keep them
your
guessing.
game, whatever. Anyway, ask yourself, all right, do I have what is the reason why this challenge dice is in here? And if you know the reason, you're going to know what a despair result may do.
Yep.
But in saying that, sometimes a despair result may come up where you're not prepared for a despair result.
Absolutely. Yep.
And yes, you have your players run out of ammunition, they fall over or something like that. But not every situation that you roll that check, it isn't going to be obvious. Especially like social encounters where despair can be tricky. Especially if you pass with a despair.
Yeah.
So there is other things you can do. And this is we've been discussing this recently. Use a despair to do things like move a PC or an NPC along the initiative chain. Bump them up, one or down, one up, one down, etc. Even if the player rolls a despair, flip one of their story points in the GM's favor. It's essentially banking a story point.
Yep.
And that action alone, especially if it's their only story point left in their bank, the players are going to feel a real sense of dread.
Yep.
And really, you've done nothing to affect their moment of time, but something could come along later because of that, and the GM could flip the story point back later after he's had some time to think about it and go, well, you know how we flipped that story point across before because of that despair?
Yeah.
This is why. And the players are going to think you, the GM, have had this grand plan the entire
All
time.
along. Yeah,
But you haven't. You've just made it up and you've adapted something to the story as it's unfolded. You've used elements that have come after that check.
Yep.
And made something really cool out of it. And you're going to wow your players because they think you're a genius when you're not.
Damn it, they're onto my secret.
We've seen behind the curtain. The veil has been lifted.
Oh, dear. So any final thoughts on upgrades?
How about upgrades the other way?
In what way?
In the favour of the players. Upgrading one of their green dice.
Okay.
It's even though it's not in the vein of difficulty, but it can happen sometimes if the players do something phenomenal, like good role playing. It's good. You may, instead of adding a boost dice, that role play was excellent. I want to upgrade your skill check.
It's not something that's specifically discussed in the rules, but it is definitely something that could happen.
Yeah.
It's doing that, even though it's small, and as you say, the difference between a green dice and a yellow dice statistically isn't that much different. But nothing makes a player feel better than having a free upgrade.
Especially for good role playing. So it's
Encourage that great role playing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
and even if they do
Or
something,
even adding boosts.
yeah. Well, even especially with that, keep in mind maybe when you do that, what might a triumph mean in this situation, and suggest that to the player.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, so we've covered the basics. We've talked about boosts and setback die. We've talked about upgrading and increasing. One of the things that I just want to touch base on very quickly, which does come up a lot when it comes to social interactions, is that, and I know that Mike and I have spoken about this, is that if you've, by rules as written, if you are negotiating with somebody or you're commanding them or you're trying to charm them or whatever, using a social skill, that there is an opposed skill and there is a chart which says what skill you use for a certain thing. So if you're trying to coerce someone, that it's going to be a cool check. If you're trying to deceive them, it's a vigilance check.
Yeah.
There is nothing wrong with adding additional setback die or adding additional difficulty die.
I'm a big fan of additional difficulty.
Yeah, and because if you've got someone who's just, they have 2 in willpower and you're trying to intimidate them, right? But you've painted the scenario that they are some brutish person, but because willpower is effectively their dump stat.
Because on their printed stat block you've pulled from the back of the sheet, it doesn't match the character you've presented.
No, that's right. And so you've just wanted to do things on the fly really quickly, and suddenly you've got, this guy's got 1 or 2 willpower. That doesn't make sense that, your little PC is going to be doing this coercion check. So why not? Because of disposition, because of the scene, you're adding difficulty dice to that scene.
It's something that I'm surprised Genesis doesn't cover in the social encounter rules, because it doesn't take into account your opponent's disposition to you.
Yeah.
As it stands, you could potentially tell someone, get them to do you can get them on your side quite easily, not factoring other things that might be putting them into an opposing state against you. If they're your mortal enemy, it should be more difficult. When you start off by using their base opposed value, then adding difficulty to that. If you crack open the Star Wars role-playing book, it actually suggests adding more difficulty dice if their disposition is not
good
in your favor.
Yeah.
You can also add setbacks and things like that based on maybe you failed to tell a lie earlier to this person or, you know, whatever the situation may be. Don't be afraid to add that just because they don't have the thing, you know, the particular item that does this, or, you know, they don't have the rule that does this. Situations can influence social check.
Yeah. So social's funny because you sort of walk a bit of a line between going against what we said before, where you shouldn't change the difficulty.
Sure.
But in social encounters, I think that's where it can be the most mutable, because you don't want to give it all on setback.
Still try to be consistent with the person that you're talking to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Disposition. I'm going to say that word a million times. I love that word.
Yeah.
It's a huge thing. I think disposition needs its own like little modifier chart. Add 1 or 2 purple dice if it is dispositions X, Y, Z. I know it came up in a recent game we were playing, and one of the characters was just a complete social monkey. They could just talk anyone down. And a situation came up where they were versing a big brute in the middle of the street who was in the middle of a berserk rage. And because by raw, this guy could talk this guy down very easily.
Yep.
And there was no taking into account his berserk rage and the fact that he didn't know the players. There was no reason for this guy to be friendly. And it was beyond the scope of just setback dice. Sure, I could have added 10 setback dice, but that's adding 10 setback dice, which is probably a bit too extreme. So that's why just one increase in difficulty is huge, because players can't use things like knack for it and whatnot to eliminate that. And that goes against everything we've just said. I know that, but social's weird.
Yeah, because keep in mind as well, you can't social someone during combat. You've got to have that's a province of things like escape and tirade.
That's where it gets extra money. But
but someone can be in a berserk rage without being in combat. Like they can be angry and on the verge of going to combat. You can't just talk them down.
But sorry, Kaitlin.
Oh, I was just agreeing with everything you guys are saying, but I was also going to add as well is that remembering the type of equipment that your characters are carrying, particularly when it comes to social ones, because that could be a really interesting way of having boosts and setbacks or upgrades, because there is equipment out there that if you are wearing this particular type of garb that you are better at social situations, or if you are trying to talk to a high noble and you're wearing nothing but rags, or you're trying to talk to someone and you have this giant sword on your back. Like these are all things that actually, as if normal social situations, even if we're in a fantasy setting, those types of things all have an impact and all can change and all can influence the difficulty that you're setting with who you're talking to.
Hold up. Are you saying that my blood berserker can't wear the skulls of his felled foes in the courtroom?
Oh, I'm sure he could. That's just where the setbacks and difficulty get higher.
Okay.
He certainly can, particularly if he starts to threaten the judge with one of those skulls going, here's all the other judges that tried to sentence me.
I will add you to my collection.
Look, something...
People can be very emotional, and it's very hard, particularly if you're in a berserker. You can get, even if you have the skulls of your enemies around your neck, you can still be a very emotional person.
I mean, I don't get it personally.
Well, at least, say what you will, at least he's accessorizing.
But just touching base, something that you just said, Martin, as far as that social checks are outside the realm of combat. I don't necessarily like to draw the line there. And the reason why, but linking that into what we're talking about, is that, if there's suddenly a firefight and there's a guard who is, or an officer or whatever else of this facility that you're breaking into, and they can see this firefight going on, and you race up and you give them a command to open the door, or they're going to get shot or whatever else. That's in the middle of combat. But it may be a case that the difficulty goes up, or there may even be boost die because you're the one that's raced up with this big gun
That's disposition. But there is one of the golden rules is that there's an exception to every rule.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Is there an exception to that rule?
Yes.
Mind blown.
But yeah, I think the rule of thumb should be that social checks aren't necessarily
social combat is separate to
that's it
to combat.
Absolutely.
But there's nothing that says that you can't do social checks in combat,
Correct.
or vice versa.
Because not every social not every social check is a social combat, because you don't want the players to suddenly go, well, I need to start dealing strain damage to this guy for 5 turns before he even considers opening the door.
Yeah, that's right.
So sometimes you just want to have that check resolved then and there. And that's when disposition can come really in handy. Hey, that guard realizes you're a prisoner trying to escape, so why would he even open that door for you? Because, you might be super charming, and he may only have 2 purple dice as the opposing factor.
Yep.
Chances are, because he knows if he opens that door, he's going to lose his job and all these other things.
Yeah.
It's very bad for him.
Yep.
So that's when disposition can be used to basically emulate an entire social encounter in one check.
Definitely. So we've covered, as I said, we've covered the basics, we've covered boost and setback, we've talked about upgrading and increasing.
And other things along the way.
And other things along the way. Competitive checks. That's something that sort of, when it comes to difficulties and whatever else, normally it's a fairly set thing. So it's just you make a check based on your skill, the opposition makes a check based on their skill. Should we be looking at increasing or decreasing the difficulties in those sort of scenarios?
I think
We've sort of discussed it.
Yeah, that sort of comes almost into, it comes close into what we were just discussing before of disposition and whatnot. But in terms of competitive checks, probably the most infrequent check you ever make in this game, let's be honest. Because it's 2 separate dice rolls and you're challenging for more successes, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the other one is opposed checks. And not to get those two confused, I know I do sometimes, like which is which. But yeah, competitive checks is quite infrequent. But in saying that, someone else you're competing against may have the edge over you. They're in a faster car, for example, if you're racing. And you could represent that with boost dice. That's when the handling or even the speed difference in the cars, or depending on how you want to interpret the scene, there's lots of factors that can come into play with competitive checks.
Yep.
Not necessarily, I think increasing would be pretty rare, unless in some circumstances where it was the exception, I guess.
Well, as we discussed, disposition.
Disposition, yeah. Disposition is a house rule brought to you by a podcast.
Look, the other thing as well that, and I know we sort of touch base on it with regards to phobias and things like that, but one thing that Genesis provides us that hasn't necessarily appeared in Star Wars is things like motivations.
Yes.
So, I mean, motivation does play a part in the Star Wars RPG, but it's sort of it's its own thing.
Tacked on almost.
It's a tacked on thing.
Yeah.
It does play an important part, and I don't think a lot of campaigns necessarily used as much. No, but in this game we have 4 motivations that are affecting us, which is your flaws, your strengths, and whatever else. So those sorts of things can also impact the difficulty of a situation, mainly with setbacks and things like that. But if it's something which you've shown through storytelling of the campaign as a whole, that you've really zeroed in on something, maybe that should be increasing the difficulty. You know,
that's motivations is great. I feel maybe they may be underused in some groups from the players and the GMs alike. They don't realise the power that sits behind those for the GM and the players.
Yep.
I know when we ran a game not too long ago, the sci-fi game that I was running, and we had that social encounter with the big bad.
Yep.
And I used the player motivations to give boosts and setbacks, depending on what they were saying and what was unfolding.
Yep.
And I know one of the players really, really cleverly used advantages to learn the fear of the guy they were trying to talk down. And then they were able to use that knowledge of the fear and add boost dice to their checks. And it was fantastic. It was it really gave a sense to who the players were.
Yep.
Just with using some square cubes.
Yeah.
And it painted this picture to this NPC
Yep.
who was a stat block with a name
Yeah.
5 minutes before that. But that NPC ended up being a fairly, I wouldn't say integral, but everyone ended up sort of hating him at one point.
Yeah.
But then became important later on, and everyone was a little bit more attached to him because I started to learn who he was.
Yeah.
It was really, really good. It wasn't just an NPC you glossed over.
Yeah.
And that came from, well, I felt anyway, from behind the GM screen, it felt like the players invested into him and then he invested into the players by using motivations.
Yep. Definitely.
That's a slight off topic, I guess, but boost dice and setback dice really came into play there.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's probably brought us to the end of a discussion on difficulty, but I think that hopefully has given you, the listeners, a bit of an idea as to how you can set difficulties and run with it more on the fly rather than just reading it from the book. And there's some great examples, don't get me wrong.
You know, I would say setting difficulty is probably the wrong way to describe it.
Okay.
Anyone can set a difficulty.
Sure.
But I think this is more learning how to do it by feel.
Yep.
So you want this to become second nature for the GM for Genesis. Anyone can learn how to set difficulty by reading the rule book, but the nuances of it, that comes from A, listening to us because we're amazing, and B, just play time.
Yeah,
just
absolutely.
Play the game, be open to new things, and just make it second nature.
Yeah.
And then your games will improve vastly.
Actually, before we go any further, there is one thing that I want to raise, and it's with Magic. Touching base on the last episode, the system itself is fairly distinct when it starts talking about what you can do, and it gives some really good examples of how you increase the difficulty and whatever else. There are going to be some things, and I know that I've been speaking to a couple of people about this online, that there are going to be a couple of things that aren't necessarily covered by the rules.
Yeah.
Or even they suggest certain things in the rules, but that isn't the only way they can be achieved.
No, that's right. So I don't think that there is anything wrong, because ultimately a Magic skill check is still just a skill check.
Yep.
There is nothing wrong, providing that you keep in mind that you are setting a precedent. There is nothing wrong to say, in this particular scene, what you're trying to do is going to be this difficulty. I seriously, I don't have a problem with that, because that means that you're not stopping play to look through rule books. You're making an informed decision because as a GM, you've familiarized yourself with the Magic rules, but I don't think, as long as you're setting the expectations before the start of the game, that there are going to be some difficulties that I'm going to set just purely because it's going to keep the game flowing, that you can make available and then change later on down the track, but you're just setting that difficulty straight from the start.
Not just with Magic. Like this comes down to not stopping. You should never be stopping at the table and breaking out the rule book to look up a rule if it can be easily resolved by setting something at the moment and looking at it after the game.
Yep,
Because doing that, sure, sometimes it can be an easy resolution or whatever, but if you got to stop the game and it has to grind to a halt for the sake of one or two difference in the coloured cubes you roll, who cares? Just
doesn't really matter.
Yeah, people prefer I as a player prefer the story just to keep moving, opposed to me sitting there for 15 minutes waiting for two players at the table to resolve that.
Yeah,
and then they fail exactly, and then they fail the check. And you're like, well, that was useful.
Yeah, that's right.
after it all happens, but I guess you could put it to akin to dead air.
Yep.
When nothing's happening in the table because players are looking up rules, yeah, sure, it might be satisfying for that one player to get that rule spot on, but it's 100% not satisfying for everyone else at the table, because they're sitting there and they start cracking their phones out. They lose interest in the game. As a GM, you've got to be aware of that. And if your players start going down that road, the game starts to suffer.
Well, as an example, because, we talked about it in the last episode about using, comparing it to other game systems. How many game systems are out there where somebody is casting a spell and they have to stop play so that they can look up what the effects of that spell is? That's effectively doing the same sort of thing.
It is.
And for those people who may not be used to Genesis, that is a case of, well, you still got to stop and read up the rules. Wouldn't it be better if you could just move on from that?
It's tricky because at the same time, sometimes you do need to look up stuff. And that's unavoidable. But when the worst times is when a dispute comes up or a misunderstanding or seeing a different eye to eye for a rule. And that's what you really want to avoid.
Yeah, and if that happens, go with the GM.
Yep.
At the end of when everybody's getting up from the table and the game's over, then have a chat if it's appropriate to do so at that time.
Chat, cage fight. That's how we saw things.
I'm taking bets already.
Wow, it's the whole Thunderdome thing all over again, right?
Cage fight over lava.
Yes, while suspended on a tightrope.
Yes.
Very good. So
we have our next Genesis setting.
Wow.
Tightrope wars.
Tightrope wars.
Yeah.
That's just what? Anyway, moving along. All right. Well, that was a great discussion, guys. So, if you do have something you'd like to hear us talk about on the show, there is a multitude of ways that they can get that information to us.
It's not difficult to find.
It is not difficult to find. One, a simple check.
It's pretty simple.
It's a simple check. Yeah.
Or some people might find it daunting.
So, but yeah, there's also people do send us questions as well. That
my favorite color is green.
Your favorite?
No, wait, that's not it.
You like walks on the beach? No, seriously. Do you think that it might be a really good section to talk to people about?
About my favorite color. If people are interested, I'm willing to talk.
No, red.
Right. Wow. It is really difficult to get you guys to talk about behind the screens.
Behind the screens.
And welcome to Behind the Screens, where we, the hosts of the show, will answer your games and rules questions regarding the Genesis role-playing game. Now, tonight we've got a couple of questions, so to start us off, Mike, would you like to take us through the first question?
Our first question comes from Lars Jorgensen. He asks, hey Dicepool, I have a question for you. I have run 6 RPG sessions with Genesis as the GM. I've never experienced a system that almost automatically drives the story forward. My players also think the game was really good, but when we evaluated the game, 2 of the players told me that the despair results that they made their characters appear incompetent. Have you any idea how to handle that? I'm thinking that the players just need to say, can we do another thing with a despair result, something that will not make my character appear like a fool?
That's a very poignant question, really, considering what we just talked about.
Yep.
Martin, what's your take?
Well, one of the things that makes it a little bit difficult to answer is we don't have an example of exactly what the despair result was.
No.
However,
I'm very... Lars, buddy.
If you're going to send us a question, make sure you give us all of the information.
Aunt Baru is very upset right now.
Oh, wow.
but
She's burning mad.
Mike, too soon.
You're on fire, man.
30?
Stop it. However, he does ask us, about the idea of having your players ask for a different result.
Sure.
Yes and no. Like as we said, having your players suggest sometimes when they're familiar with the system what a despair might be, or putting it to the table can be a good thing. But you don't want them objecting every time a despair result comes up. You don't want it to turn into an argument. It will slow down play. But
I don't think there's anything wrong in hearing from a player's perspective about what they potentially think the despair could be used for. I mean, when I think of despairs not only in something that my character maybe did do or did not do very well, but despairs could also be something else is happening to the character or something else is happening to the environment. Doesn't always have to mean that whilst the player fails, they fail horribly to the point where it's like, are you really a PC or are you just the NPC that people happen to talk about in taverns that's completely an idiot? It's one of those ones. It's a balancing act in terms of thinking about how a despair can be used, but also including the players in actually deciding how that despair could play out. I mean, I look at things with my characters like 9 times out of 10 because I think it's funnier or because I think it adds something that will be memorable. My character will tend to do something stupid, but that's just me as a player. Not all players like that.
a good thing. As an example, say they've tried to accomplish some task and they've failed, but with a despair, so they've fallen flat on their face in the time. That could make them look, incompetent.
Yeah.
Maybe instead of them falling flat on their face, the despair is that someone watched them fail. That is something simple. It's not making it too difficult, but it does.
It maybe affect their reputation, that sort of thing. I mean, the other thing to keep in mind as well is that despair doesn't mean that you failed. And this is the important thing that you have to remember with both despair and triumph. It can sometimes be an easy thing to do to go, I failed with a triumph. That suddenly you've actually really, you've succeeded in the check, where in actual fact you failed. And the same sort of thing happens where you've succeeded, but you rolled a despair.
Yeah.
Don't suddenly degrade the success of the check with something that ultimately makes them feel like it's failed.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
As we said before, it's tough to gauge exactly Lars's situation here. What happened to players?
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to be the devil's advocate here and say players can sometimes get too attached to their characters.
Yeah.
And that despair, they may not like because they feel, that my character wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
But, sometimes things happen to characters which they have no control over. That's life. So maybe the players just need to accept fate sometimes. But then again, it's hard to say what happened in the situation. But the players at the same time, it's that old golden rule, respect the GM's call sometimes.
Final call. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And raise it after the game, which they've done, which is...
Exactly.
Which is good.
Yeah.
They've talked about it. I mean, it's actually not something you see very often is when people... I know that we do it, but some people just play and then end of the game and that's it. I think that it's important as a GM to actually ask for feedback from players.
Yeah.
And it's sometimes it's important for a player to ask feedback from other players as well as the GM to make sure that the game is still flowing. There's nothing worse than just letting a game just keep on running when there may be a problem that's festering.
Where there's been a toxic seed planted.
Yeah. To get that out there, be a grown up about it and talk about what's going on during your game. Obviously, have a post-session debrief. Like you've gone to see a great movie. I mean, you've probably played a great movie by playing the game. Talk about it. Deconstruct the scene. What worked, what didn't. And there's going to be some things that, as a GM, that you're running on the fly that you won't know what to do with it. That you've just taken your best guess, and that you can fall over. As a GM, you can sometimes roll the despair or a certain number of threats. So, just take on board. It's not an adversarial thing. It's an important process because you're doing something that everybody's enjoying or wants to enjoy. Make sure that you're covering all of that.
You could have this post-game discussion or cage fight above lava.
Yes.
I like the second one.
I know what my vote's for.
Wow.
We can have an amicable discussion in a cage above lava.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm thinking
on a tightrope.
The amicable discussion is probably the best one. But, hey, look, if you live somewhere near a volcano or a lava pit, why not?
There's a group of players out there somewhere in the world who live near a volcano, and they're like, right, our time to shine.
I can't wait to see the headlines.
Well, they've probably been doing it this whole time, and they're like, I knew we weren't fools.
All right. So, hopefully, Lars, that has answered your question. If it doesn't, we apologise profusely. But that was a good example. All right, Kaitlin, would you like to take us through the next question, please?
Sure. So our next question comes from Brett Bowen, and he asks, I've been wondering how you would model mounted combat in Genesis. I know referencing Star Wars Stay on Target is a good start for getting stats, but using vehicle rules seems a little complicated for what it will be used for. Most of the stats would be personal scale, except for speed and handling. Then there's forced movement based on current speed. Are those free range band changes? So a mount at speed 1 or 2 would be forced to change 2 bands and could change 2 more with maneuvers. I hope that made sense to you guys.
There is a lot of crunch in that, but the thing the thing that he's referring to is Stay on Target, which is the Aces book from the Age of Rebellion line for the Star Wars role-playing game.
Legitimately, the most not surprising at all book to find rules for animals in.
Thank you to the Beastmaster or whatever, the Beast Rider or whatever it is.
Beast Rider.
Yeah. So, look, vehicle combat is probably something that we'll do an entire show topic on at a later stage, because there are some significant differences of which we've been doing a little bit of playing with vehicles recently.
And it oozes with nuances too.
And it does. And I mean, I was so surprised the quite large differences between Star Wars and Genesis when it comes to vehicle combat. So, yeah, how about it?
I think the first thing that comes across to me from Brett's question is that we're referencing Star Wars.
Yeah.
Which one of the important things to note between Genesis and Star Wars is the vehicle system is completely different.
Very much so.
We don't do that. So Stay on Target isn't relevant here at all. And this question is actually answered in page 83 of Terranoth, where it discusses mounted combat. And the way it does it is that a horse or any other riding animal, they just don't treat it like a vehicle at all. So there's no force movement.
Yeah.
Basically, when you get on a horse, you and the horse become one person, essentially, one unit. And when you spend a maneuver to move, you actually move as if you'd spent two maneuvers.
Right.
So what you're saying is mounted combat via Terranoth isn't actually vehicle combat at all. It's usually
not at all. It's
regular
personal
scale combat.
Exactly.
That is so much easier.
So much easier. Now, you might be asking then, how do I shoot the horse or whatever? It just uses the aim maneuver. You need to aim to target the horse specifically. And if you take out the horse, the rider goes prone and they take, I think it's 3 strain damage.
Yep. And when we're saying aim, we're talking about the called shot. So you're getting 2 setback die. And if you do a second aim, you'd be down to 1 setback die.
Correct.
So as opposed to aiming where you're going to gain a boost.
Poor horse, though.
Yep.
Poor horse, I know, right?
And if you're on the back of a horse and you're attacking someone on the ground, you gain a boost to hit them, and the person on foot trying to attack you gets a setback to attack you.
I'm really glad that Terranoth has actually made that distinction of mounted combat.
Yep.
Because I know the monster rules found in Stay on Target, they are kind of wedged in there to make them work.
Yeah.
The fact they have to use vehicle rules to have the monsters work, it's kind of weird.
Yeah.
It could be so much more simpler, which have obviously recognised and put that straight into Terranoth.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that I do want to add, if you're on a flying mounted animal,
Not flying. No.
you've got to look at the flying rules, which are in the core rulebook.
Yep.
On page.
Wait, you're saying I could be riding a griffin?
A griffin? Yes. It's page 100.
Oh, I've missed the Griffin reference.
Don't worry, my griffin's flying.
And we won't go into this because it gets a little bit complicated. But
Sure.
if you're hovering, you can only go as high as medium.
Yep.
And you don't have to spend any maneuvers during your round. You're not forced to do that. However, if you're on a flying, and hovering, just one maneuver is one maneuver, unless you're on a horse that can hover, maybe a reindeer.
Wow.
Or
There's a Christmas live play.
Pegasus.
A Pegasus, or a Griffin.
Or griffin.
You would spend one maneuver to move to.
Yeah.
But if you are on a flying creature, you can go, one maneuver gets you anywhere within the range bands.
Right. Yep.
But you have to spend one maneuver every round. But you don't have to change range band.
Yep.
You can sit in the one spot, you're circling around, but you have to spend a maneuver.
True. Well, hopefully that's answered Brett's question that, you may be overthinking it by using Star Wars. And I think that it's easy to fall into that trap too.
Yeah.
Is to use Star Wars. It's just, it is a different system.
Well, we didn't realise that Terranoth had mounted combat stuff until only just recently.
Yeah, and until Terranoth was released and we got a good chance to have a read through that. But it's good. It's great. So there you go. Hopefully that's answered those 2 questions. But if you do have any other questions, as I mentioned before, like these, you can send us an email to info@thedicepoolpodcast.com, or you can post your questions to either Facebook or Twitter.
You can also visit us on our website, thedicepoolpodcast.com.
And make sure to like and follow the Dicepool Podcast on Facebook and Twitter by searching @Dicepool Podcast. We also have our community group on Facebook that you can share your ideas and activities, which is always great fun for us to see and perhaps mention on the show.
And you can also find us on YouTube by searching @Dicepool Podcasts. So if that is how you like to consume your podcasts, check us out there. Or hey, even just head over there and give us a like. That would be amazing for us.
We would like that.
We would like that.
And give us an idea if that is something you would want to see more of in the future. Because, I don't know, YouTube's interesting.
And you can also look us up on the D20 Radio Network, on Discord as well. Drop us an email or a message on there.
An email, you old man, you.
Or you can drop us a message on Discord, and we'll see if we can bring that onto the show as well. But it was a really good discussion on difficulties and answering those two questions. So yeah.
Well, initially I was really worried when we started this episode because this is going to be a difficult conversation.
Right, yes.
But it turns out it was nothing but triumphs. Triumphing, really.
It was pretty daunting.
There was no despairs. Well, maybe a few despairs internally.
I only had a minor setback.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Right, exactly right.
But it gave me a real boost.
Well, turns out we just have a knack for it.
Right. Well, we do have the advantage, that we are running a pretty cool podcast.
Too far.
Wow.
Even with all the threats and lava and everything like that, I think we managed to persevere.
We certainly have the ability to do this.
Yes.
Well,
and we can help our listeners, hopefully, to succeed. So
I think we should flip a story point on this one and say that's a wrap.
Absolutely. So thanks, everybody, for listening. Join us next time. So I'm GM Hooly.
I am GM Huzz.
I'm GM Flano.
And I'm GM Kaitlin.
And together we are the Dicepool Podcast, where adventure is just a roll away.
Still feels like we need to say we're the Power Rangers or something. We've come together united.
And by our powers combined,
we are
the Dicepool Podcast.
I was going to say like team
Martin,
awesome
though.
guys.
Wow, you people are odd.
Don't forget to send us emails, guys, at our Discords. The Super Friends.
Right. The Dicepool Podcast is a proud member of the D20 Radio Network. For more information about the network, visit www.d20radio.com. The Dicepool Podcast is a fan-generated podcast. All of the information provided on the podcast and related website are not affiliated with Fantasy Flight Games or any of their licensed swords. The content of this podcast remains a property of the Dicepool Podcast and is intended for educational and informational purposes only. The Genesis role-playing game, the Genesis logo, content, and all material remain the property of Fantasy Flight Games.